Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jen Rubenstein. I am thrilled to welcome you to panel 15.01 of the WPSA 2021 conference, Disorienting Neoliberalism, Global Justice, and the Outer Limits of Freedom by Ben McKean, our author meets critics panel. And let me just say, I'm so excited to be here. And Ben knows that I'm not just saying this because I started pestering him last August or maybe July, because I not only wanted to read his book, I wanted to teach his book. And when was it going to be available? When I'm texting him. And so I can honestly say it's a terrific book. I recommend reading it. I recommend teaching it. And I'm super excited to discuss it. First, Ben will speak, and I'm going to introduce all of our panelists now in the order, and then they'll speak, I guess, in the order in which they're on the program, and you guys can just go from one to the next. First, we'll have Charmaine Chua from UC Santa Barbara. Then we'll have Andrew Dilts from Loyola Marymount University, and then we'll have Julie Rose from Dartmouth. And I think it's totally fine to ask questions and stuff and chat in the chat. Ben, is there anything else before? Okay, over to you, Ben.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Jen, and thanks everyone for being here, especially to the critics, but thanks to everyone for coming. I'm really excited to have a chance to talk about the book and to actually hear from folks who've read it, since there aren't that many of those people out there. So let me I'm going to presume that folks in the audience haven't read the book, so I want to just start by explaining a little bit about it. And the book sort of starts by thinking about some of the, I think, characteristic injustices of the contemporary global economy. So I start by talking about an incident that happened in December of 2012, just north of Dhaka in Bangladesh, when the Tazreen Fashions factory caught fire. It was producing for many US-based multinational corporations like Disney and Walmart. And in the fire, about 125 workers were killed, leading many people to compare it to a kind of 21st century Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, with all of the kind of hopes that this might result in reform that were implied by that. But just a few months later, a disaster, literally an order of magnitude greater, happened when the Rana Plaza factories collapsed, killing more than 1,100 workers. And so I take these kinds of injustices to be characteristic of the contemporary global economy and to be really representative of some of the problems, particularly with global supply chains, which are now represent something like 80% of global trade. So a very significant part of what it means to be living in a global economy today. Meanwhile, in the United States, we've been wrestling with decades of growing inequality, decades of deepening precarity that we're facing as workers. As consumers, we're also connected to these supply chains through relentless surveillance of our consumer behavior, often through our phones. When you walk into stores, which we haven't been doing much in the past year, but in the before times, if you'd walk in, stores have like Bluetooth beacons in them that can tell exactly where you are. They can estimate how long you're standing in front of displays. And they use all this information, they correlate it with lots of other publicly available data about you. And then they sell this, right? They package all this data to sell to other retailers. They connect it to your internet presence. And they use this to try and train consumers to be, in effect, kind of more willing to share their information, more reliable in the way that they participate in the market. So I want to suggest that both these ends of the supply chain are connected, and that we can really understand what's going on here by thinking about the role of neoliberalism in shaping our contemporary circumstances. So I think of neoliberalism as being a kind of political theory that defines freedom as choice in the market, and that sees creating and sustaining efficient markets as the primary value of politics. And so the world that neoliberalism has made, as the title indicates, is a disorienting one, right? We live in a world where, my iPhone they estimate it has components from 43 different countries in it, right? There's something it's the kind of fact that, as I sort of talk about in the book, no matter how many times we repeat it, it just seems like a hard thing to grasp. It's a hard thing to connect to kind of practical knowledge about the world. And so I ask, well, how can we make sense of this? And so I suggest that one way that one task that political theory can perform is to help orient us to the world. And I suggest that an effective orientation to the world, one that can promote effective political action, has three components. One is an account of how social and political arrangements actually operate. The second is an account of how those operations are made intelligible and legitimate to the people who are subject to them. And then third, there's what values we should be promoting in light of those circumstances, right? In light of the fact that we are living under certain unjust circumstances that are legitimized in certain ways. So we can't simply say in our present context, oh, well, I want to promote freedom, I'm going to use freedom against neoliberalism, because neoliberalism has its own account of freedom, one that's quite powerful and has done a lot to shape people's self-understandings. And so you, just by invoking a value without thinking about its context, you risk, you risk having your work do ideological work that you don't intend it to. You risk legitimating circumstances that you mean to undermine. So in the book, I proceed by explaining the kind of neoliberal theory of freedom. It's giving an account of neoliberalism as a political theory. And I try and trace some of the places where there might be opportunities to reorient ourselves toward neoliberal circumstances. Part of how I do that is by tracing inadequacies within neoliberal theory itself, but also by looking at the gap between its theories of legitimating these operations and the actual operations of the global economy itself. And so to do that, I provide an account of global supply chains, not as neoliberalism would have us think of them, as kind of spontaneous and self-organizing, creatures of the market, but as political institutions, as in fact, institutions that seek to govern us, that make claims to authority and legitimacy. Right? So you have pundits like Thomas Friedman talk about efficient supply chains like they're symphonies, giving these kinds of aesthetic accounts of their wonders. And part of what I try to do in the book is to show that we can better contest them and the injustices in them, like the Rana Plaza collapse, by understanding them through this understanding of them as political institutions. We also, in our resistance, I suggest, need to be guided by an alternative conception of freedom. As I suggested, since neoliberalism has its own theory of freedom, if we want to engage in emancipatory struggles, we need to offer an alternative account of freedom in order to do that more effectively, and to better resist ways that neoliberalism might capture emancipatory claims. And so to do that, I offer this alternative account of freedom by I try to draw from a coalition, a wide range of thinkers and theoretical traditions, in order to offer an account that many different kinds of theoretical traditions can endorse and belong to a kind of political coalition against neoliberalism. So I start in the book by drawing resources from Hegel and John Rawls to show how there is a social conception of freedom that undergirds egalitarian liberalism, as well as many other traditions with their roots in Hegelian thought. But the way it's developed in egalitarian liberalism, I argue, is inadequate. It assumes that the world is one that we can and should be reconciled to. And so I argue that we need to transform this tradition. And to do that, I turn to W.E.B. Du Bois, Theodor Adorno, and in places Gloria Anzaldúa, to suggest ways that we need to modify this value of social freedom in light of the fact that we can never achieve what I call in the book, drawing from Rawls, freedom at its outer limit. Given the circumstances we have grown up in, the injustices to which we've become habituated, we can't experience the outer limit of freedom. And so what does it mean to be guided by a value that we can't actually experience ourselves? And so I turn to these other authors for help thinking about the orienting value of freedom in this context of tragic injustice. Having done that, I then argue that looking at the context that we're in, the right way to express our freedom today is through a disposition to solidarity with others who are also engaging in emancipatory struggles against neoliberalism, that we can express our freedom through this disposition to solidarity. I contrast that with other arguments that seek to resist neoliberalism through efforts to revive national sovereignty. And in the conclusion, I try to show why people might find this disposition to solidarity attractive, why they might actually want to do that in the world that we're in. And so I contrast that with dispositions to reactionary resentment and humanitarian sympathy. And I talk about why joining and supporting transnational social movements could be an attractive way to express freedom, and why it might help us understand ourselves to see our struggles connected with the struggles of others. So that's a very brief kind of overview of the book. Hopefully I kept within the time we were aiming for, and I'm really delighted to turn it over to the panelists for their thoughts, which I'm really excited to hear.
Charmaine, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, my screen is screwed up, so if it looks like I'm looking off to the side, it's because I've got an external screen, so it's not that I'm not paying attention. Hi, it's good to see everyone. I should say that I come to this work and to Ben's work as an interdisciplinary scholar of supply chains who was a political theorist many, many years ago. And so I'm not a scholar who's familiar with Rawlsian debates on global justice, and I want to sort of just say that I enter this kind of conversation both as a thinker around supply chains and supply chain management, but also as somebody who's currently organizing in and around supply chain transnational movements. And so I would love to, especially in the Q&A, talk a little bit more about what Ben conceives of as forms of participation in these social movements, in part because I think, I think this part of my question, and I think Andrew is also going to talk about this, is not just, that we should participate in transnational social movements, but how, right? What kinds of movements? And so I'll get to that in a second. But first, I want to say everyone should read this book. I'm really excited to teach it to my students. I find it to be an incredibly clear, lucidly written, and beautiful sort of slow laying out of why we need to think more centrally about supply chains as modes that orient us within the global economy. I see it as one of the best chapters I've read on neoliberalism that I've encountered. It's crystal clear on that account, and so I really appreciate that. And I think it'll be a really useful teaching tool. So liberal media and scholarship, I think, often approach the problem of supply chains, and this is probably outside of political theory and more in the realm of people who think about global political economy, through, in the sense, their distributed structures of accountability. And so Ben points to some of the things that I think are always raised when scholars write about supply chains, which is, their hierarchical operations under what is putatively formally egalitarian relations, their dizzying global reach, the fact that they are sort of spread across massive scales of production, circulation, and distribution, and the governmentality that they produce between workers and employers, as well as the terms of trade that they set between developed and underdeveloped nations. But I think most of the scholarship that kind of tries to think through supply chains understand it through, I think, think about how to respond to the disempowerment that supply chains offer through two kind of modes. The first is through corporate social responsibility, which can either rectify or repair the damage of capitalist relations through a kind of myth of ethical consumption, which Ben very sort of convincingly dismisses. And the second is a kind of sense of corporate accountability, right? So in the wake of the Rana Plaza collapse, it was about efforts to hold corporations accountable, to place blame, to think about whether human rights law or international agreements or awareness campaigns might reveal the exploitative and deplorable conditions that lie within supply chains. Both of these predominant narratives, I think, produce a familiar kind of story in which the violence of capitalism is an aberration or an exception, right, from a fundamentally and putatively good system, rather than one through which violence is fundamentally constituted. And so Ben, I think, in situating global supply chains as forms of neoliberalism that also disorient us, I think, produces a really useful way of thinking against these two kinds of approaches. But rather than just, I think, refute these approaches on the basis of their empirical validity, so showing us whether they work or not as responses to supply chains, Ben's book, I think, is powerful because it pushes us not to think at the level of institutions, but in terms of how we are situated as subjects within global supply chains, right? And this is why I think it's particularly useful as a teaching tool, where students are so often told about global injustice as something that we can respond to through policy level work or through response through international institutions. but this is really a book about orientation, and the fact that that's the kind of motivating thread throughout the book is not a coincidence, and I'd like to talk about that. So ultimately, I think, what is the most useful thing I found about this book is that it helps us think about how individuals might orient ourselves to the dizzying scale at which the global supply chain economy operates. So I'm going to talk about 3 things I find useful about this approach, and then 3 accompanying questions, and hopefully they are linked. So the first that I wanted to talk about is what thinking about global supply chains as a basis for thinking about global justice and freedom can do. As most of you know, there was a giant boat stuck in the Suez Canal this week. And because I do work on logistics, I fielded a bunch of media interviews about #StuckBoat. And what I found really interesting about some of these interviews is that even though what was directly in front of us was this massive ship that that brings 80% of the world's goods across these oceans and to our shores, even though the immediate concern or the immediate sort of thing in front of us is a heavily material thing, a lot of the questions that I was asked in media interviews were not about supply chains, were not about worker relations, were not about the sort of processes of commodity circulation, but about this kind of abstract thing called global trade. And so I think that there is an interesting abstracting tendency in the popular imagination about how global capital circulates, where its operations often seem so out of grasp that the tendency is to abstract into sort of generalizable forms, right? Trade deals, trade deficits, balances of trade, so on and so forth, that sort of are understood through the language of aggregate demand and figures rather than through the kind of material processes that actually suture us across these physical spaces. And so in contrast to this approach, what Ben's book, I think, powerfully gives us is a way to think about supply chains as actual links, as material links that bridge people across these international circuits of capital. And the fact that we operate in this world of things, right, all of which these days are produced by low-wage labor far away from us, gives us, I think, a more material basis on which to grasp questions of global justice outside of purely theoretical or liberal frames. But here I think Ben goes one step further, which is that he doesn't just say, let's think about supply chains as an orientation to global justice, but he pushes us to think beyond the narrative of unmasking, which has a long history. And there's a really wonderful point in chapter 2 of the book where he thinks through the ways in which we have long relied on a kind of myth, right? That unmasking the inequalities behind supply chains, revealing their injustices, the deplorable aspects of low-wage labor would somehow kind of reveal what is behind the veil and then produce a different form of action. I think Ben's book is remarkable in that it not only exposes the constitutiveness of the violence of that capitalism, but understands that unmasking cannot be sort of sufficient as a mode of moving us beyond a kind of knowledge of injustice towards forms of action. And so he goes through and runs through, an argument that says, right, that we don't just need a new theoretical vocabulary. We don't just need to know that supply chains are unjust forms, but we need to find different forms of dispositional orientations that can help us rethink that. And part of what's powerful about this, even analogically, is that anybody who has tried to organize, right, even within the academic enterprise, where we spend our professional lives avowedly professing our radicalism and our knowledge about things and our commitment to unveiling injustice, and then somehow repeatedly engage in behavior that is counterinsurgent. Most of us who are working within the Neoliberal Academy now know very well that if you've ever tried to even get faculty to sign a letter condemning the administration in some way, right, that how hard it is to do that, I think is in way testament to what Ben is trying to think through, which is the persistent myth that knowing about bad things then produces action to orient ourselves against bad things. So that in itself, I think, is an incredible contribution of the book. But I think, let me skip ahead because I feel like I'm taking a while. How far am I into my time, Jennifer?
You are 9 minutes in.
Oh no. Okay, so let me move ahead a little bit because I want to talk about where this brings us. So I think pushing us to think beyond knowing and then an assumption that knowing leads to action, this is where Ben's mode of pushing us to think about orientations really is clarifying. And here I think Ben works against a kind of dominant neoliberal way of thinking in which the flattening of all choices into individualized decisions about market freedom produces a kind of what he calls a neoliberal disorientation. I think, so Ben uses the term neoliberal orientation in order to help us think about the ways in which neoliberalism as a concept produces forms of dispositional subjectivities to global capitalism. And I think that rather than using the term neoliberalism, which I think many critics have said, right, by saying things are neoliberal, it doesn't necessarily offer us a way to think through how neoliberalism both justifies actions and then reproduces modes of being in the world that then sort of reorient ourselves to those kinds of actions. In a sense, neoliberalism obscures not just what is going on in the economy in terms of, exploitative relationships and so forth, but it obscures our sense of relationship to what is going on. And so there, I think when Ben turns us to neoliberalism as something that disorients us, what he pushes for us towards is an account that isn't just about exposing what neoliberalism is, it's about thinking about what meaningful action entails and what a reorientation as an ethical mode for reshaping our understanding can do. And this is where Ben sort of pushes us to thinking about freedom, not just in a dispositional sense, but in the question of what it might look like to think about freedom, not along the lines of responsibility, but kind of solidarity in which shared interest in the just world should push us towards partnerships with people across the supply chain. So one question I had for Ben coming out of this is that the notion of orientation was unfamiliar to me as a kind of as a word or as a way to think about this. I think other theorists of neoliberalism have used the term neoliberal ethics as a way of thinking about modes of subjectivity. And I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about and help us theorize what orientation does for you as a kind of conceptual mode of thinking about these kinds of relationships. I think my question then also becomes whether a mode of reorientation gets us sufficiently outside of neoliberal modes of thinking and towards the kinds of shared freedom that you point to at the end of the book. And I'll say more about this in a little bit, but I think part of my question about the term was that we are so fixated on the idea that what is produced is a kind of relationship that obscures neoliberalism, that the solution then becomes a reorientation. And there's something interesting there because you, at the end of the book, start saying that reorientation isn't just about sort of seeing ourselves differently, but beginning to participate in social movements in ways that can then generate new insights and new dispositions towards freedom as we work in social movements. To me, that was like one of the first times when I felt like, oh, I'm reading a political theorist who was an organizer. And that was, I think incredibly insightful, right? That we don't just arrive at positions of knowledge, but that we have to work through them and to fight for our freedom in and through them. Okay, so the third, and I'll try to do this quickly, is what I think is really worthwhile about the book is helping us to think about how helping us to think not just about the supply chain as an exploitative or unjust form, but how to see ourselves as supply chain subjects. And so here, Ben, I think, pushes us to think about how workers and consumers are not just sort of, becoming points in the supply chain at the moment of purchase, but as, in a sense, permanent subjects of that supply chain, right? Who are constantly surveilled by corporations, whose modes of participation in social media, by liking our gig economy workers who delivers our pad thai, by even generating things like teaching evaluations at the end of the quarter, are in some sense already part of this kind of mode of just-in-time production and the kinds of consumptive patterns that they produce. And so Ben pushes us to see supply chains here as political entities, right? Not just as points of market freedom, but entities that require coercive institutions. And I think importantly, as ways of organizing difference. And here he draws on Anna Singh's work to think about how supply chains in some sense require bigness without homogeneity. So there are these massive forms, right, that are in some sense universalizing in the way that they structure the relations between workers and consumers. But they also in that process fundamentally organize differences, forms of uneven relationships, so on and so forth. But here I think is where my trouble with the book kind of started happening. And I'm going to preface this by saying the rest of my comments basically boil down to why not Marx, which I recognize is an asshole question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So Ben starts with this kind of assumed liberal starting point, right? That if supply chains are understood as political institutions and we understand them and such, we might then be able to reorient ourselves as consumers in a sense. Part of what's interesting in this account is that throughout the book, even though you make lots of caveats that, you know, it's not always the case that the consumer in the global north is the same kind of consumer, you still, I think, throughout the book, tend to relate that relationship of workers and consumers across the supply chain, such that it is that when we think about workers, we're thinking about workers, low-wage workers in the South, in the global South. And when we think about consumers, we're largely thinking about middle-class or wealthy consumers in the industrialized North. And so for you, I think the point of the book and the starting point is that the appeal to a kind of, you know, thinking within liberalism to get us outside of its modes. I think the subject that you assume to hail is the global North consumer. And I wanted in part to ask, right, that when you say supply chains should be understood as political institutions, part of what I was wondering is the fact that supply chains aren't political institutions a narrative that's accepted by anyone except liberal consuming subjects in the global North? So in a sense, supply chains are very obviously political institutions, forms of governmentality, coercive to anyone who's worked within them, not just low-wage workers in the global South, but certainly logistics workers who work at Amazon and so forth. And so in a sense, part of what I'm asking is, you know, who is the audience for this book? I'm assuming it is a kind of a liberal subject. But in the process, I think what I wanted to think through is the ways in which, you know, I guess the question is, why get liberals to see themselves as consumers linked to workers within the supply chain? Why not get liberals to see themselves as workers too, who are oriented across sectors in different ways as workers? And here I think this is where, you know, part of what is one of the critiques and questions I had about the book is that, you know, you render the problem of supply chains as one in which consumers might enjoy real material benefits from consuming supply chains that sort of obscure injustices. But supply chains, in a sense, also cause the kinds of inequalities that we are facing today. So the fact that so many workers are in a gig economy that's precaritized, the fact that many low-wage workers in the global North are not necessarily, are both consumers who have to go to places like Walmart because that's where goods are cheap, where they don't have necessarily the kind of power to exit that relationship and to choose to consume more ethically. These are also, I think, things that are caused by the globalization of supply chains, right? So, so the question I think for me was, if supply chains also cause the forms of precaritization, gig work that orient us in the global North, not only as wealthy middle-class consumers, but as workers who are inscribed into supply chain in that precise way. And if we want to see workers as partners in reform rather than as objects of concern, why at the end of the book do you choose to help us think about or push us towards a reorientation to solidarity? Why not class war? And why not help us to think about our role as workers in building those solidarities as workers with workers in the global South rather than as consumers linking with those workers? I'll stop there. Sorry for going long.
Andrew, do you want to go ahead?
Well, not after that, because now I want to be like, yeah, okay, no, why not class war? Let's, yeah, okay, yeah. Thank you, Charmaine. That was fantastic, and I think there is going to be some resonance between some of our comments today. But I think I might take this in a slightly different direction. So yeah, my absolute deepest thanks to being part of this conversation. I've had the great privilege and pain of knowing Ben for more than a decade now. I say that with all the love in my heart, right? Because I think he and I have been arguing about some of these things for far longer than will be apparent in the brief comments that I offer here today. And I just want to say this, I don't think we often talk about this enough when we come into spaces like this, right? That like the time, literal decades, the amount of energy that goes into taking a project like this from its earliest seeds and seeing actually what Ben does in parts in this book of narrating his own autobiographical experience of coming to this project is something that we so rarely do. And I deeply appreciate it here. And it's just one entire level. It's an absolute joy to read a book that I've heard bits of and I've read long pages from, and I feel like I got to have been a bit of a, I won't even say partner, but in solidarity and through some of this work over these long years. And it's just I have to start there before I start saying terrible things about the book, right? I actually just, it's been an absolute joy to see this book grow and to then see its fruition right now with this crowd today. And I'm actually not going to say anything terrible about the book. I think it's an excellent book. I likewise share Charmaine's strong recommendation and Jennifer's recommendation that this is actually an incredibly teachable book, that this is actually going to be an incredible use for anyone who's teaching both at the undergraduate and graduate level, doing that kind of difficult summative work about entire fields of literature that cuts through the chaff and actually names the really important issues in them. As somebody who has been fighting about neoliberalism, how we should theorize it and phrase it, right? Chapter 2 is, yeah, it's fucking good, right? It just, it clarifies and it names things in ways that need to be named and are going to be useful, and refuses, I think, the really flat conversations that, as my students say, the discourse would lead us to think about some of these topics. So I'm going to be doing, I usually like to have something written because I'm not great at like staying on focus, but I'm going to fall back onto the trick I think I learned. There's a handful of you Chicago folks in the room here today of various connections, and I feel like this is one of the things I learned there well, is that always ask questions rather than make statements. And if you can, explain how your 3 questions are actually the same question, just asked in different ways. So I'm going to try and do that here. So I don't know if orientation, this framework has got me spinning in this way and thinking about it both in its sort of spatial dimensions of being oriented toward a thing, but also maybe to its sort of temporal dimensions, where we are in time, or if it's because of the upside down in which we all seem to be living right now that I'm confusing space and time and the very, foundations of geometry perhaps, or I've been watching too many episodes of the Great British Bake Off, so everything happens in threes right now, right? Or these are my own deep dialectical attachments, but I have 3 questions. I think they're related. I think they're the same question. And I'm thinking them spatially and temporally at the same time. So question 1 is going to be about what is behind, beneath, or the past tense of the book. Question 2 is going to be about the surface or the present tense of the book. And question 3 is going to be about the beyond or maybe the future tense or the propositional possibility that the book invokes. So let me just go through each of these and make them more concrete. So question 1, the behind, beneath, past tense. Then this, I think, will echo slightly something Charmaine has already said about audience and for whom the book is for. And as I said, I think one of the things that I love about the way Ben works in this book is he introduces us to his question and our question honestly and openly in relation to his own life as an organizer, as a graduate student studying political theory, through the dissatisfactions that happen with that study, to finding other spaces to think through it, to continue to be connected to transnational social movements, right? And being honest about that entry into the conversation is something which I think political theory has a is at war with itself about, right? Where that we're stuck with, if you're not doing a absolute radical self-positional critical theoretical approach, then you've utterly failed. And if you're not positioning a universal subject, then you've utterly failed. And I think the mark of any genuinely good critical theoretical account is to refuse some kind of distinction like that. And I hear echoes of Iris Marion Young's actual practice of political theory when I read this book, right? And the famous introductory pages of Justice and the Politics of Difference, where Young says, right, I speak from this position and I recognize that's limitations, but I also know I cannot speak without those others for whom I cannot speak, right? And naming that relation is, I think, part of what Ben is doing subtly and carefully in the book. He tells us how he came to this, and he tells us how he came to an important way. It means I can't entirely decide if this is a work of critical theory in which John Rawls is the object of critique and rescue, or if this is a work of egalitarian liberalism in which materialism actually makes a difference. And Ben is honest, and I think the goals of the book really are to convince egalitarian liberals that, one, their institutions, if they have such things, their intuitions, if they have intuitions about the global economy, are correct, that the global economy is an unjust space. If they have those intuitions, they may not. So egalitarian liberals who think that have good reason to think that. So two, there is in fact a vein of analysis within egalitarian liberalism which can support that analysis and address those injustices. Although, as Ben shows, even that vein of critique within egalitarian liberalism will fall short, right? So even in the Hegelian Rawls that Ben gives us here, right, and who Ben has been arguing for as long as I've known him, right? And actually, if Rawlsians would actually read what Rawls read, would also see is not in fact a different Rawls, but is in fact Rawls, or a part of Rawls, right? That even if there is that vein that allows them to affirm their intuitions about the injustice of the global economy, even that vein is also going to be limited, right? And that if we are going to, as Ben puts it, be able to authorize retrospectively the institutions in which that define our freedom, we don't live in that world, and neoliberalism has broken our ability to do that work in a Rawlsian or Hegelian fashion. Hence, the book hinges right at the middle to we have to have other resources, right? Given this diagnosis of neoliberalism, which again, as I said, I think is more or less accurate, right? I might emphasize some different parts of it perhaps, right? Rawls cannot get us out of this mess, but other, interestingly, also Hegelian inflected accounts of freedom might be able to get us out. So by the way, I think now I realize this isn't a book about Rawls, it's a book about Hegel. And it's about Hegelianisms, as it turns out. And I think Ben is honest about this. This isn't, I don't think, a book for Marxists. And I think the tell is that where he wants us to get is this place which, perhaps this will be unfair, is a new overlapping consensus between egalitarian liberals and Marxists. And I invoke that phrase because I think that's also the place where I have a real worry. I'm not sure that's possible or should be. That the meta level overlapping consensus where the coalition between egalitarian liberals and Marxists or abolitionists, right, is if it could ever be a stable coalition. But I feel like because of the past tense, the behind or beneath of this text, that's the place we're arriving, is even a provisional perhaps coalition, but one which relies that the assumed audience is someone who needs to have their intuitions affirmed and be very carefully led to someplace else. This is perhaps the Lord's work, and thank you, I guess, for doing it. But I'm also like, oh, it's not. I'm not sure I'm the audience for this book, although I learned a lot from it. So two. Oh, as a question, right? So yeah, so who is the audience? How are Marxists? How are deep materialists? How should they come into the book, right? So two, the surface level of the text, the present tense, its presence. And I think here is where I have a slight disagreement in your reading of Du Bois. I think actually this is my briefest sort of moment, but I think it might be an important difference, right? So this is actually a wonderful chapter in the book where Ben has shown us that the Hegelian egalitarian liberal account, right, gets us to the diagnostic moment, but cannot get us out of it, right? Because the current conditions, the actual conditions that have produced produced in no small part through commitments to egalitarian liberalism by some folks, right? As Ben notes repeatedly, cannot reorient us on its own, right? It requires a different mode of reorientation. And he turns primarily, actually, I read to W.B. Du Bois on this. Adorno makes appearance, also Duza make appearance, but it's really Du Bois. I read this primarily as a Du Bois chapter. If I'm wrong, please correct me. And I think actually this is a masterful move in one sense, because it reminds us that there has always been a tradition which is able to simultaneously both understand the current moment and see that that current moment is anything but given. This is the resource of double consciousness, right? The resource of the two-ness which is felt by those people who have been, in fact, systematically excluded, constitutively excluded, perhaps, to borrow from, I think, somebody who was in the audience here earlier, right? Constitutively excluded from the membership in the polity, right? That they're included through an exclusion, have a particular epistemic ability to diagnose this, right? And Du Bois gives us this in the language of double consciousness. And I think that part is right. What I'm worried about, though, is the way you read on the meaning of progress, chapter 4 of Souls, right? Where there's this, I'm obsessed with the same lines that Ben is obsessed with. Perhaps this is also what happens if you teach in the same core curriculum briefly and you're always arguing about the same books, right? Where Du Bois invokes the awful gladness that he feels at the passing of his own son, and he invokes the necessarily ugliness of progress as he stands and looks at the new schoolhouse that stands in the place of where he previously taught in behind Hill and Vale in Tennessee. Ben, I think, focuses, you rightly here, you focus on the sort of necessity of the ugliness, right? That progress always has costs, and what we need is a thoroughgoing accounting of those costs. I don't think this is wrong. I think, though, that there's another really important part about the way Du Bois describes that moment, which is that he says as well, I sat musing, whether it was dusk of dawn, whether it was the bride of, this was the, I'm going to get the line wrong, right? The beginning of a new day or the end of one. He's genuinely confused of whether his read of the situation is dusk or dawn. And I'm struck by this because this is a place where I think one way to read this is the Hegelian Du Bois, right? Where we need to understand the dialectical progression of history and able to be able to recount da-da-da-da. But the other would be the Nietzschean understanding of Du Bois at this moment, where what he's, I think, in fact, saying is there's no settling this question. There's no actual knowing whether it's dusk or dawn. Progress imposes on us the temporality by which we're supposed to understand these costs and these benefits. As Nietzsche would put it, right? Any genuine progressist would be an accounting of all the blood and violence and murder that the winners have decided to justify, right? And I think what I read Du Bois is saying in this moment is you can't get this measurement right. How do you measure progress where Darkfist Josie lies? You can't measure progress. Ugliness might be its aesthetic attribution, but there's actually a necessity of letting go that moment presentness and that present fixedness in that. Here's why I think that matters. Question 3 in my remaining minutes. Where we go from this book has to be right. There is no recourse to existing transnational governmental institutions. There is no reformist policy that will do this. Insurgent social movements is the only way to build genuine solidarity. Yes, I think this is right. Repoliticization of what has been depoliticized is the work that is necessary too. And perhaps, I won't even dare to say, maybe is in fact sufficient work for then doing another project. Repoliticization of depoliticized space isn't just a means towards an end, it's also a kind of end in itself, in that we now may sit in a place where knowing what's going to happen next isn't our goal, but what is happening in the moment actually drives our politics and our action. So this would be my way of asking, that social movements is, yes, the right answer, but how and which social movements hasn't been addressed. I feel like I know where you're going to go here, but it doesn't seem to happen yet in this book. And I need to hear more about how we will distinguish between those social movements that engage in genuinely repoliticizing deeply democratic, I need to know what the adjectives are here, the kinds of social movements that'll do this. And part of this is because I've been learning a lot from my colleague at Loyola, Ashley Campy, in her study of right-wing social movements, about just how effective social movements are, in fact, at depoliticization when they're geared towards neoliberal ends, but also to revanchist, white supremacist, and heteropatriarchal authority. Those are social movements too. So okay, they're the ones I don't want to engage in for this practice, but just social movements can't possibly answer that question. I don't think you mean to say that, but I need to hear that extra bit, right? What we need, I think, are non-sovereign social movements, as you say, social movements which reinscribe the state, social movements which rely on the discourse of human rights that can only be guaranteed by the state, might also be necessarily implicated in your analysis, right? Egalitarian liberal social movements may not actually be able to provide the out that you've diagnosed and described, right? I'm convinced by your argument that not even all left and left-leaning social movements can be sufficient for this, but this is the place we need to, I think, push further. We need non-sovereign movements, or if it's sovereignty on the mode of Glenn Couthard or Audra Simpson or Leanne Simpson. It's forms of indigenous sovereignty, which are not predicated on the nation state, right? Let me close by going maybe all UChicago here for half a second and give a Straussian reading of the last line. Sorry, it happens. Even those of us who hate it, we're always a little like, I got to look at that last line again, because in the last line of the text, but I'll read it for those who say, justice cannot be immediately realized in a neoliberal world where the wealthy have disproportionate political power, but by working together, we can prefigure in our attitudes and actions the fuller freedom and equality that we seek. And prefigure is what I get stuck on. Because there is a tradition of prefigurative politics, a tradition of prefigurative, anarchist, deeply democratic social organization. And I think this must be the way out. That any social movement response to the neoliberal order has to be a necessarily prefigurative social order, one in which we don't measure our success through legislative gains, through electoral victories, but through how the organizing is happening prefiguratively. I think prefiguration has to be the goal and the way out, but then prefiguration has to be given its substance and its content, right? This is why when Diva Woodley discusses the movement for Black Lives, she notes that it's essentially a radical Black feminist pragmatist social movement. How the movement for Black Lives organizes is as if not more important than what it organizes for. The relation between the how and the doing are essential in that sense. Or, not surprisingly, abolitionist projects always say how we organize is in fact how we produce the world that we seek to live in, right? How the relations dismantle and shut down while we transform has to be the place we go. If Ted Cruz can be a Rawlsian, again, there's a Princeton problem here, but I don't want to get into that right now. If Ted Cruz can be a Rawlsian, right, then egalitarian liberals can be dominating agents. Abolitionists can get it wrong, but at least the abolitionists, as Charmaine actually I think has written in recently in a piece too, admit they might be getting it wrong, right, and assume that their practices are provisional, prefigurative, and the place to go. Thank you.
Julie?
Great, thanks so much. And thanks for those comments, Charmaine and Andrew, really fascinating to listen to. So like has been said universally here, the book was really a joy to read, just wonderful to read, partly, of course, for some of the personal connection reasons, like Andrew was mentioning, like seeing the development of ideas over time, but really just standing on its own. I don't think one needs to have any connection to the book to find that it's a real joy to read. It's really rich and deep and rewarding. And I found, as I was going through it and like uncovering all of its layers, I think also Charmaine kind of talked about this, the layers of it, just how remarkable the book is in both its breadth and its depth, and the kind of care and comprehensiveness that Ben brings throughout to like the wide array of topics and thinkers that it engages with. And I know that it's a book that I'll be thinking about for a long time and going back to, especially different sections I kind of have already mentally flagged. It's like, I need to keep thinking about that or go back to that part. And I think also is the way that others have mentioned about for teaching, and they're like, they put chapter on neoliberalism as a clear one, but I think even specific pages of other parts, I might think, oh, just that page, I'll give them, on different topics. It will be, on all sorts of different subjects too, which is really impressive. So overall, just a really exceptionally impressive book. So thanks very much for the chance to be here on the panel. Okay, so my comments then, they really aren't taking the form of the critique, but a set of just questions, really. And there are a set of questions on just one aspect of the book. Like, so I've said, is really rich in its breadth and depth, and my questions are going to be quite narrow in a way. So Ben directs us to think about political theory as an orientation, and I think that he really constructively advances our understanding of what it means to do so, to think about political theory as an orientation, and why we should focus on the theory in this way, what that would entail, and how to assess the effectiveness of a theory on those terms. So I take Ben to really be advancing our understanding of how to do political theory as orientation well. And one of the appealing features of this aspect of the book then is that it can, of course, also generalize to other subjects. And so I wanted to ask Ben really just an invitation to say more about how, really just to elaborate more on how you understand your view of political theory as orientation in that spirit, if you were to be providing, say, guidance to others who were trying to follow along that path and to do political theory in the same way. So some of these questions are informed by Ben's excellent APSR article on what makes a utopia inconvenient, which you can see a lot of the connections to in this book. And there, Ben is drawing on Geuss and Williams and Rawls in developing his account of an orientation, as well as Foucault and Malcolm X. But as I read it, it's in the book that Ben is really developing more fully his account of political theory as orientation. So Ben has already mentioned this in his remarks at the beginning, but just to recap, he very helpfully says that being effectively oriented to one's political circumstances, this is a quote from page 6, requires accounting for 3 features. 1, how social and political arrangements operate. 2, how those operations are generally made intelligible and legitimate to those subject to them. And 3, the normative values that one's actions should promote in the context of 1 and 2. And so when effectively oriented, individuals can undertake actions that they believe meaningfully contribute to realizing their values in light of their actual circumstances. And then Ben, throughout the book, at each turn, comes back to these 3 general features of an orientation, and then uses them to critique the neoliberal orientation and to provide an alternative orientation. And I think one of the things that's distinctive about this approach, so a lot of normative theory focuses, of course, on 3, the development of normative values. And then some also, of course, give some attention to 1, which is, an analysis of how the political and social world is actually operating. But it's really doing the 3 in combination. So also attending to the way in which those operations are made intelligible and legitimate to people that is, particularly effective and distinctive about this approach. So as I mentioned, so I've just got some questions, and like Andrew, they'll take the form of the 3. I've got 3 questions here, of course. One couldn't have 2 or 4. And I should also be clear that these are really genuine questions. They are not, in fact, critiques in disguise, as many questions are. Okay, so and I'm just going to give the questions in a kind of general form, and then I thought it might be helpful to try to think it through with an example, and then I'll just be quiet. So the first question, and thinking about the 3 here, is what's the order of proceeding through an analysis here? So in the book, of course, we start with 2, an account of the predominant legitimation, i.e. neoliberalism, and then we move to an account of 1, which is actually really looking at how the social and political world operates through the analysis of the supply chains, before turning to 3, developing an account of the normative value, this another understanding of freedom to rival the neoliberal understanding of freedom. And but I wonder more about how much are the normative values driving our approach to an orientation. I take it, of course, that the normative values are not developed a priori they're very much contextual, but are they really like the driving force behind our orientation? Another way of thinking about it is, in what ways might our understanding of 1 and 2, i.e. how the world operates and the predominant legitimations, affect our understanding of 3, our normative values? So how much movement could we have in our values because of what we see when we look at 1 and 2? Okay, the second question is, how should we evaluate the possibility of alternative legitimations being predominant in a society? So I take it as Ben notes that there often will be multiple orientations available to us. And there also, I think, would then be multiple legitimations that are in circulation to explain our social world. So if we're trying to promote particular values through our actions, and we're trying to do so in a way, in an our non-ideal, unjust world, in a way that doesn't unintentionally reinforce the predominant legitimations, then what should we do when there are multiple legitimations in circulation? I'll try to give an example of where I think that might cause some trouble. But, okay, and then the third question is just to say a bit more about how we should evaluate the success of an orientation. So I take it that, I think, Ben, in the book, and you can say if I've missed some, but I think you draw attention to a few different factors in particular. So the most direct one is, of course, is it effective in leading people to act in ways that do in fact promote their values? I take it that's kind of like a major one. But then also, kind of the flip side of that, does it actually instead just reinforce the existing injustices unintentionally? And then also, what is its effect on people's self-conceptions? And that too relates back to the first one. In particular, does it shape people's self-conceptions in ways that are consistent with the underlying value, or in ways that are intention? So I take it those are the kind of primary standards, and of those, the first one, is it effective in leading people to act in ways that promote the value, is the really predominant one. But I wondered if, especially when you understand them together, might there be some kind of subparts to these standards that might be worth unspooling and saying more about? I was thinking in particular about their psychological effects. So of an orientation, its effects on people's motivations, their optimism, their despair, their resilience in the face of injustice, those kind of considerations. Also, their how much do they foster people's ability to persuade others, to forge alliances, to foster ties, even in cases where our normative values don't directly make appeals to solidarity. So that's, of course, quite straightforward in cases where what we're trying to promote is solidarity. But even in the cases where solidarity is kind of, not center stage, could this be another criteria for the success of an orientation? And then sort of related to both of those, I was thinking about the ability to foster generational change over time. Okay, so just very briefly then to give some examples. So I find it often helpful to think through, especially when trying to generalize through some other examples. And so, Ben, I think provided this really helpful example early in the book about an orientation with respect to persistent racial disadvantage, and in particular, the racial wealth gap. And so he, points out that we need to consider the normative value of political equality. 3, Ben very helpfully refers to them by number throughout the book, and it's really fixed in my mind in a very, so I will also be referring to them numbers. In the context of our inegalitarian and hierarchical political and social institutions, and the fact that those institutions are legitimated through appeals to formal equality. And why it's especially helpful to think about the normative value of political equality in the context of 1 and 2 is that it's important then to be able to pursue the value of political equality in ways that don't, in fact, just entrench existing political equality. So it exposes the real problems with taking a, formal equality, race-blind kind of approach. So it's a really nice example there. One of those passages I thought about thinking, I should just give my students that page whenever we talk about that topic. Okay. So then I was thinking about the case of gender equalities as a way of kind of thinking through, of course, intersecting with race and class, and with respect in particular to caregiving and work. So one would be our existing patterns of gender inequality, how the world works. And then let's say that our understanding of the value that we're trying to promote, I was thinking of Nancy Fraser's After the Family Wage, this idea of deconstructing gender, that we would want to live in a world in which all people can do caregiving and other forms of work while also having leisure and having respect. And that this is something that all women would have, not just privileged white women, and indeed all genders would have. And so then if we think about, well, what are the predominant legitimations of our existing inequalities? Here it seems like there might be a few ones in circulation. There's a kind of traditionalist one focused on gendered caregiving, sort of market-oriented one, focusing on work and income and paid caregiving. And then also, I think there's also sort of legitimation in circulation that's a sort of, you can't have it all kind of a line, which is that, you just have to choose. People aren't entitled to all of these nice things kind of attitude. A sort of lower your expectations sort of attitude. So, okay, so anyway, just to then put them back in the context of the questions. One way of thinking about the question about, what's the place of values in driving the orientation is how much does which legitimation is predominant shape how we would develop our normative values? So you might think if we're in a society where the traditionalist one is predominant, we might really focus our values in a way about how this does not promote the equal freedom of all, the equal real freedom of all, or something like that. But if it's instead we're in a can't have it all kind of legitimation, should our values instead focus on like the multidimensionality and richness of our entitlements? Our values might take on a different form depending. That's the one question. And then similarly, if we have multiple existing legitimations and we're trying to promote a particular value without in fact perpetuating the existing legitimation, how should we navigate the fact that there are these multiple ones there? So I was just thinking about, in some cases, providing subsidies for caregiving, private caregiving, might reinforce the kind of market-oriented approach. But if that isn't a real problem in our society, then we might be less worried about that. Or shortening work hours might work in some cases, but might in other cases strengthen traditionalist legitimations, the kind of mommy track sort of things. So I could say more about examples, but you can kind of fill it in. Yeah, and then the last point is just about successive in orientation, especially in the cases where people can't directly act in accordance with their values, which I take it as like the kind of the core of the difficult case. So in this context, it would be in the cases where market forces make it optimal at the household level for people to continue to divide labor in a gendered way. So what kinds of how should we think about what an orientation would be doing to helpfully direct our actions and people's self-conceptions? And just to elaborate more on that kind of, I don't want to repeat the earlier question. So anyway, just to close here, to emphasize, these are all entirely genuine questions, really just invitations to say more. And just about how Ben understands how to do political theory as orientation well, a way that Ben's really beautifully and compellingly illustrated with this book, and the answers to each of them might be just, it's hard in the way that I've demonstrated, and you have to do it. But thanks very much.
Ben, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, thank you all so much for these really wonderful comments. They're really, I think, incredibly helpful in seeing, like helping me see the book in a certain way, because, having been so close to it for so long, I don't, in a lot of ways, I don't know it, right? Like, I don't know what it is in the world because I don't know how it reads to others. And so it's incredibly helpful to me to get such incredibly generous and engaged and thoughtful readings of the book to help me think through it and to help me think about its flaws and limitations. So I think let me start with Charmaine's comments about why not class war as being kind of the organizing like orientation, which I think is a really important question, because I think that there is, as Andrew sort of pointed out, I mean, there is a book that could be written for an exclusively Marxist audience that's precisely about this. And I think that Andrew's right that this isn't exactly that book, although I don't think it's, I hope Andrew's wrong that it's not a book for Marxists. I think it is a book for Marxists as well. I think it depends on what kind of a materialist you are and what role you think identity and discourse plays in shaping people's understandings of their interests and shaping their understandings of what it means to be a worker. Because I do think that, I mean, really, in a sense, this is kind of connecting a lot of the different questions that Charmaine and Andrew raised. But, you know, a lot of people in these right-wing populist movements are mobilized as workers. They do think of themselves as workers. A lot of people were mobilized as workers to, you know, beat up people protesting the Vietnam War. And so I think part of what the book is trying to do, so that is to say that how people think about themselves as workers is not unconnected to this neoliberal orientation that I do see as being pervasive. That in a sense, I don't really think that we're faced with a choice between mobilizing people as workers or consumers, because people do understand themselves as both. And I think about talking to my own students, teaching them about like supply chain stuff and sweatshop issues and so forth. Some of, you know, many of them work full-time. Many of them have experience working in like local Amazon warehouses. And they still think about, they've still been habituated to think about what can they do as being a matter of ethical consumption. That's still a starting point for them as well. And I find that really striking. I think it does speak to the extent to which people's understandings of how they can express freedom, people's understandings of where they have power are really deeply shaped by neoliberalism. And so part of why I suggest reorientation is an important part of what we do is because I think it is about recognizing the power of how people are presently oriented and recognizing needing to find ways of addressing people that recognizes what parts of our circumstances are familiar to them and thinking about how to both take advantage, so that is to say, people feel comfortable with the status quo, even at the same time as they're deeply alienated from it. And I think that the trick is to find ways of addressing them that account for both of those things, that both take into account the ways that they're shaped by not just the familiarity of the status quo, but also by the experience of feeling like, on the one hand, feeling like the status quo is absolutely interminable, that there's no way to bring it to an end, even as they also experience its unsustainability. And people live with those things together. And I think that part of what I'm trying to think through in the book is to navigate that and to think of what it means to try and move people to action based on their experiences of both those things together. Having said that, obviously the audience for the book is also shaped by my own like personal deformations, right? And I sort of take seriously that part of the chapter on Du Bois that says, you know, that is to say, Andrew suggested in his comments that one of the advantages of the abolitionist perspective is that their responses are provisional, and that is they can admit that they're wrong. And I don't think that that's a virtue exclusive to the abolitionist perspective. And I think for me, part of that is the value of the kind of, I find that in the critical theory tradition, in Adorno, and in the idea of negative dialectics. And so part of how that gets mobilized in the book, I mean, explicitly thematized in the book, is in thinking about how efforts to advance justice will themselves reproduce injustice. And so I talk about the ways in which Souls of Black Folk also itself reproduces respectability politics, reproduces patriarchy. And so, you know, I think part of it is this book is reproducing the forms of injustice I've become habituated to in certain respects. And so I do think that it's, in that sense, revealing of the dispositions that I've normalized that I perhaps ought not to. So I think that is to say, so just then to go back to some of the specific questions that Charmaine raised, like who thinks of supply chains as not political? I think it is in fact more than just middle class and wealthy consumers. In my experience, talking to a lot of people who feel the economy is, a lot of people who are dissatisfied with their own economic circumstances, nevertheless feel that they've been taught that that's not a political issue, and they've been taught that in fact they deserve their place. And part of why they deserve it is that the operation of the economy is just something that we can't control, or if we try to control it, we'll all become Stalinists or whatever. And so I think that there are actually a number of people for whom these issues do need to be repoliticized, though I certainly acknowledge that my own subject position as a middle-class consumer undoubtedly not only shapes the book, but also I think creates certain limits for the book and its audience and the way it might circulate. So as I think about why not class war, I mean, I think that maybe it is that I've become too accustomed to the new social movements. And I do sort of think that there are many different lines of struggle, many different kinds of places of polarization. I do ultimately think that these economic questions are, I mean, they shape everything. And so I think that, I guess part of the question is, as we're being materialists and in a lot of ways rejecting the distinction between politics and the economy for fundamentally materialist reasons, what then does that do to the way we think about how do you mobilizing people's identities? What does it mean then to identify in a worker that's truly an emancipatory form of identification and that doesn't reify or reinforce some of these other reactionary forms of identity? And that's part of what I try to touch on that in the conclusion in the way that the book talks about Trumpism and reactionary resentment there. But that is, I think, an abbreviated discussion, and it is also a part of a lot of the other work that I'm doing now beyond the book and thinking about populism and thinking about what an emancipatory populism might be against many of the other forms of populism that we see. Thinking about other questions that Andrew raised about the viability of an overlapping consensus between egalitarian liberals and Marxists and abolitionists. I mean, I guess part of why I think it's viable is that it just reflects my experience of organizing. I mean, I think about, the global justice movement of the late 90s and early 2000s, and it was very much, that. It was very much, I think, a coalition of those people. And I think that undoubtedly such a coalition would find its limits, but in a certain sense, our world is so deeply unjust, I don't have any idea what those, when we will encounter those limits. It seems like we're quite far from that. It seems like the scale of injustice that exists today is so vast that that there is, I think, there are, I think, many places where this exists. I mean, I also think, looking at, present day formations like DSA, many contemporary Marxists just are egalitarian liberals who don't think it's cool to be that. So in that respect, I think that there really is a lot of, in that sense, there is, for better or worse, there is overlap in the world there. So thinking about, I'm going to have to circle back on the Du Bois point. I absolutely agree that there is the Nietzschean reading of that passage, and I think that was a wonderful presentation of it. I'm not fully sure then, if the point is truly that we can't measure progress, then I do kind of wonder, I wonder where that leaves us in certain respects, but I'll just need, that's a place where I need to think more. Let me turn to Julie's questions about how to, as it were, flesh out some of the book's more methodological observations, because I want to make sure we also have time for more discussion and for Q&A. So in terms of the order of proceeding, I do think that there isn't any kind of a priori fact of the matter. I think that your point about multiple legitimations in circulation is really important. And I do think that ultimately the work of political theorizing does involve the exercise of political judgment. I mean, I do think that the thing that too few political theorists do is think about political theory as a political practice. And in doing that, part of what I want to suggest is that doing political theory well just involves making your own judgments that are ultimately political judgments about, you know, what are the prevailing forms of legitimation that most need undermining, or that we most need to worry about as kind of changing the ideological color of our own interventions. And I think that the points that you raise about the different ways theory can be effective, the points about, you know, fostering abilities to persuade, fostering abilities to forge coalitions, and also the temporality of generational change all seem really important to me. And so I do think in that sense, the book is maybe unavoidably pluralist about what counts as an effective orientation. There are, but just in part because there are many different forms of effective political action. And in a certain respect, I guess circling back to Charmaine's point about there is a tension in the book in that sense between the rest of the book and the conclusion, in the sense that in the conclusion, it is kind of true that like the thing that most effectively changes people's views is just when they actually take political action. And the thing that leads people to actually take political action is very rarely reading an academic book. And so, I mean, it's not never, right? I mean, it's like, I'm sure lots of us have had experiences of reading kind of works of politics or of something, you know, in high school or whatever, that kind of open things up for us in different ways. But much more commonly, when you look at social movements, like people come in because a friend asked them to, right? Not because they like sat down and thought about it and made a decision. That's like very rarely what happens. And so I do think that, I mean, part of it is that this process of that being effectively oriented in that sense isn't a binary, right? That there is a sense in which the book proposes effectively a retroactive account of freedom, an account of freedom which we really don't know we've experienced freedom until after it's been experienced, rather than typically a prospective experience of freedom where we decide we're going to make a choice or do something like that. Because so often our awareness that we've changed our views about the world, our awareness that we've changed our way of moving about the world and the way we see it is retroactive. You know, there's a dawning that occurs rather than any kind of sudden revelation often. And so I think that's part of why I do think the language of reorientation can be useful, and also part of why, you know, I think that there are lots of different parts of the world that are confusing to us, and there are lots of different things that can be helpful in reorienting us. And as I say in the book, it's not always the case that some of the best political theory doesn't deliberately set out to reorient us. It certainly doesn't go through the three parts of an effective orientation that I outline, right? But I do think that one way that political theorists might benefit from, one thing that might benefit political theorists as one audience for the book is in thinking about this as a way to do it. And I think there will be lots of different ways that it can be done well. So hopefully that's not just the kind of admonition to it's hard and you have to do it, but I do think that there's a value in kind of offering, I guess in that case, examples more than there is like a how-to manual. So I think we have about 25 minutes left. I don't know if any of you all wanted to come back on anything that I said, or if anyone in the audience has a question they want to pose.
Go ahead and ask your questions, and then I can, while people are thinking, I can go ahead and ask my questions, since you kind of, oh wait, I'm going to cede the ground here to Alexander.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Ben, for this fantastic book. I'm writing on disposition now, and your work was really helpful for me in this regard. I wanted to just sort of ask maybe a clarifying question about this phrase formulation that you have throughout, to facilitate action. Because I think I'm just going to repeat a lot of the stuff that previous conversation has already touched upon, but for me, it seemed like you have this strong thread in the book about disposition towards solidarity. And then you have another thread on how a certain attentiveness to facts of global injustice can, quote, facilitate action. And I'm wondering there just like what you mean by facilitate action, or how disposition facilitates action, because it seems on the one hand like you want to sort of give a lot of like sort of causal autonomy to like dispositions and like sympathy and solidarity and all that sort of stuff. But on the other hand, it seems like you want to like give a very like sort of cause effect structure of theory, like informing action. And so dispositions don't seem like so autonomous there. So I'm just wondering like what you mean by facilitate action. Do you mean that like, you know, we become aware of facts of the world and suddenly our like orientation of the world all of a sudden changes? Is it a matter of like habituation? Yeah, just to get some clarity on that, because I really enjoyed it, but I was a little confused.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I certainly, I'm very dubious in general about the idea that facts alone can move us to action, as Charmaine said. And I think that often a lot of what happens, especially in these cases, is that, I mean, the knowledge is out there. Everybody knows this stuff about supply chains on some level, in the same way that, but it doesn't do anything. And in fact, often insisting on the facts makes people less likely to do anything about it, or, because it's unpleasant to think about complicity. It's unpleasant to think about the ways in which you're a beneficiary of injustice. It's unpleasant to think about yourself as a victim of injustice. All those different things are true, and insisting on the facts often just leads to nothing, or leads to resistance. So that's not to say facts aren't important, right? But it matters what they're connected with, and it matters both what analysis they're connected with, but it also matters what dispositions they're connected with. And so orientation is one way of talking about that connection between analysis and disposition in a certain respect. Because if you're oriented to the world in a certain kind of way, you're going to be disposed to do certain kinds of things, right? If the orientation to the global economy that I propose is effective, you'll be disposed to solidarity. And what I mean by disposed to solidarity there is that partly that the facts will mean something to you, right? That you have a disposition to act, that you'll find those facts meaningful, and you'll both want to do something about it, and at least have some sense of where to start, of what it would mean to actually act in solidarity. And so I think part of why I find the language of dispositions useful is to move away from this idea that political theory is offering principles or rules that can be kind of easily followed in the world. Often, I think it's more helpful to think about a disposition and the cultivation of a certain kind of disposition as being the right kind of guidance that political theory can propose, given, as we were just talking about in response to Julie's questions, how much political judgment anyone who's a political actor needs to exercise, and that simply can't be work outsourced to a book in a lot of ways. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Other questions?
Can I do something totally rude and ask a follow-up to that? Unless there's somebody else, because I've already talked a lot.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I think maybe this, because Alex, your question made me think that this is another way of also articulating part of the, it's not just an audience question, but it's just like, what are we doing when we do political theory question, which I know, Ben, like this is just something we've been talking about for years. So I know this is like crucial. And this thing that I know I've learned from you in talking about organizing, right, is having to do this incredibly careful, like epistemological, pedagogical work in organizing spaces of figuring out where people are and recognizing that like everyone in the room is at like a slightly different place. And sometimes they're at like massively different places. And then having to somehow tailor, right, the the knowledge that some people need to get moved, the framework that other people need to turn that knowledge into action, and just then like the opportunity structure that has to be present for people who are like, I'm ready to like punch people, tell me who to punch, right? Like, and those are like all happening at the same time in an organizing space. And in political theory, we always hold one of those constant, right? Like that's kind of what we do. Like when we write a work of political theory, we try to say like, okay, I'm gonna work on this level. Here's who I'm trying to move because I'm not actually in the organizing space. And then maybe what happens, and as I'm like now projecting about my own nightmare disasters going on my campus right now, where the university president is publicly gaslighting student survivors of abuse, right? That's happening right now at my campus, right? Where I'm like, oh, this isn't a political theory argument I'm having with my colleagues, but they want it to be, right? And I'm trying to organize them, but they want to now have refuge in a political theory like both stare decisis on the one hand, but also like a ceteris paribus on the other. Like, can we just talk about the issue at hand? The issue at hand is whether the right procedural, but like, right? So maybe I think another way, can I ask this question is, who is it who needs to be moved past knowledge to action in relation to people who are already moving and like are already acting, right? Like, because I think that maybe that's also part of what like Charmaine's class warfare question is, right? There is a class war going on. It's whether or not some people will join it. And whether the burden of joining is, can I square this with my commitments as an egalitarian liberal? Can I square this to my commitments as a member of DSA? Can I square this as my commitments as an abolitionist, right? But in a sense, like, there's a class war going on. There actually is, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that part of it is informed by my sense that there are, I mean, and maybe this is in a certain sense, I guess, a deep optimism about the book, which is just that even after last year's mobilizations, there are a vanishingly like small number of people who are actually active organizers in this country. It is just, I think that one thing that's been striking in the past 20 years is that I do think that there has been a real growth in culture and communications on the left. So there's a very expanded set of cultural resources for people who are interested in left politics now compared to 20 years ago. People who care about justice and equality can get radical analyses much more. I mean, there's just so many different venues, right? From podcasts, websites, so on and so forth. And yet a lot of that, despite that, I think comparatively speaking, explosion of kind of communicative resources, there's nothing like a proportional increase in the number of people moved to action. And so I think in a sense, I remain optimistic that there are a lot of people who have not been moved to action. And I think some of that is informed by the sense that, part of what it means to care about these issues is to say or think certain things rather than to do things. But there also just remain not a lot of, I guess part of it is in that sense, there is a sense in which I don't think it's a political theory question. Well, the political theory question isn't what should we do? There's so much to do and everybody knows it. There is a political theory question about why aren't people doing it, and what would it take to change that? Those aren't just theory questions, obviously, but I guess in that sense, the book's starting point is injustices are massive and obvious. Our response is obviously not proportional. Maybe, one way that we can intervene is by thinking, what are ways in which, even despite ourselves, we've become implicated in neoliberal conceptions of freedom? What are ways that resisting that, providing alternative conceptions of freedom might change that? And what are ways in which, and how can that go along with the repoliticization of things that neoliberalism has depoliticized? So that, does that help?
Other questions? Samuel, go ahead.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for this today. And thanks to all the panelists who are, or critics as they are called, gave us a lot to think about today. So I want to push a little bit further. You know, we were asked about dispositions. I want to ask more about orientations. And particularly, I want to ask about what appears to be like a missing piece in your account of orientations from queer theory as a resource for thinking through not only our orientations to things, but also our disorientations. So I'm thinking specifically of Sarah Ahmed's book, Queer Phenomenology, right? Where she thinks of queer as a disorienting device that speaks to an approach to objects that slip away. And she names queer as a way to inhabit the world at the point of the fleet, right, at the point of its movement, right? And of course, what's so great about this panel today is we just had this great blockage, right, at the Suez Canal, which allowed everybody, or, you know, in a very Heideggerian sense, when the hammer broke, everyone started thinking about what the hammer is and how it works, right? And so it was that moment of blockage which really focused our attention on and allowed a politicizing opportunity, right? But otherwise, right, these are supply chains, these are supply lines that by their definition slip, right, that move, that are not stable and static and which don't follow clear horizontal vertical lines of intelligibility, right? They're diffuse, they're parceled out, they're contracted out, et cetera, right? And here I'm thinking along with Andrew of someone like Iris Young's work on collective responsibility versus like a liability model of responsibility, right? But so I'm hoping that you could say more about how we can inhabit this disorienting world of neoliberalism and think about the resources that we can plumb within a disoriented kind of condition, right? So that, you know, rather than trying to get us back into our right angles, right, we maybe occupy that disoriented space in a different way. And maybe the work of disposition helps us do that in ways that I'm hoping you can help us think through more. But I want to echo everyone and say, I really enjoyed the book and thank you for bringing it to us, so.
Well, thanks so much for the great question. I do think that there are, I think what's tricky is, exactly as you suggested, some of those ways in which traditionally queerness is taken as in connection to sort of disorientation and slippage are precisely terms that then seem like they may be taken up by neoliberalism and to reinforce it, right? The very sort of speed and ephemerality that's associated with the market, which neoliberalism associates with freedom, but which like Amazon logistic workers do not, because it means that they're engaged in like the thing that makes that speed possible is precisely their regimentation and surveillance. And so I think you're absolutely right that there are, the book doesn't really engage with some set of resources like that to think through orientation. I have tried to do that in some other work where I've thought about, Munoz on queer utopias in terms of thinking about the orienting function of political theory, and also to think about in connection with this, it's psychoanalytic resources also are something that the book doesn't engage with, but that I've tried to think through elsewhere in terms of the kind of governing irrationalities, right, that and our attachments to them. So I think you're right that there are real emancipatory resources within queer theory that the book doesn't mobilize. I think that there are, like, as with anything, there are risks of those resources being taken up in an ideological way that ends up reinforcing the status quo, depending upon what's valorized. And I think in particular, I think about like Lauren Berlant's work in Cruel Optimism and the sense of blockage that is kind of the genre of our life, and the way in which blockage isn't always, in that sense, revealing to people, but is in fact kind of just their quotidian experience. And And so I think it's really difficult to think about I don't think there are any, and this goes to Julie's point about the different forms of legitimation that circulate. There is no one kind of experience that's universally emancipatory, right? And I think that that is part of the challenge of politics, is then finding what are the experiences that enough people find emancipatory that we can point to, mobilize and make, actually make change. Yeah, I think maybe I'll just leave it there, but thank you. That was a great question.
Are there any questions?
Jennifer, you should ask your question.
Yeah, it'd be great.
I'm curious what it is.
Same.
Well, I now have a different question. So like Charmaine, like, I don't want to stop you from talking because I just don't want. Okay, so this is like a proposition about how to understand your book that I've maybe come to since your explanation and response to Charmaine and Julie. So my proposition, and this is like put too strongly, is that there's almost like, I don't want to use the word schizophrenic, like there's like two big narratives going on here. And one narrative is I'm going to start. And so this, okay, so this comes from my students, right? Who are not Andrew Dilts. Like they are like, they are not Marxists. They like, feel bad. They are the person, Ben, who's like handing out, like half-heartedly handing out pamphlets in front of, in front of Disney World. Or so they feel kind of bad, but they don't know what to make of that. And so on the one hand, you seem to set yourself this really hard task of inviting them in. Like here they are, they're a little bit like you. They haven't quite started handing out the pamphlets, but they're thinking about it. And you do the thing that like theorists of global justice do a lot. Like here's a really big disaster. This is going to like motivate us to think about this. And that seems to be sort of drawing us in. And we're going to, and this goes to Julie's question, we're going to start with like understanding what's going on here, the proper way to understanding, and then by the end of the book, you move us to action. And in the conclusion, like here's participating in social movements. But I also feel like there's another way in which you're going in the exact opposite direction. And you're helping activists understand, and this is what I think you're exactly right. Like so often it's action that precedes understanding, right? And we're not going to intellectualize ourselves into this. We're going to action ourselves into it. And our action is what's going to motivate us to understand what we're doing and understand our predicament. So in that sense, I also feel like this is maybe Ben who's done the activism and who is then like explaining to the activist how they can sort of understand themselves and what they're doing. And this is why, like on the one hand, my students were like, well, we don't really feel like our freedom is at stake. The only thing that's going to motivate us is humanitarianism. I'm like, no, that's not what Ben wants. But then part of me is like, no, maybe you're sort of okay with that because whatever gets them into action, and then it's that action that's going to produce understanding. So like, am I right to see both of those sort of temporal strands at work in the book? Question mark.
Yes, so, and I think that it does speak to the way that the book, the way at least the book as I conceived it, tried to speak to both kinds of audiences, that is to have work that it could do for political theory, but also work that it could do for people who are activists around the global economy. And I think that you're right that those things have different kinds of temporality. And so in that sense, part of why the book, part of what the book is doing is that, a lot of people find these traditional approaches to global justice compelling, even though I think they're deeply flawed. And I think a lot of the action undertaken, to the extent actions undertaken under its guidance, it's often counterproductive. And so in that sense, there is a way in which the book is trying to, as you put it, invite people in and then show them why that kind of familiar thing isn't the thing that they thought it was. And that is that, and I think that maybe this goes to Sam's point, that is why I would think about reorientation rather than disorientation being the kind of productive mode. But I think that also gets to Andrew's question about like, well, what kinds of social movements are we talking about here, right? Since it's absolutely the case that not every social movement, even very well-intentioned ones, it is actually like liberatory or emancipatory. And I certainly share your, and the worry about something like effective altruism, as you really well outlined in your own work, is that like taking action under that, there are ways where that can be self-reinforcing. That is a community of people. that has relations that they probably do experience as being at least internally egalitarian, but which very much nevertheless involve paternalism and even domination over others. And so I think that the part of what I try to talk about, just, and I think Andrew's right, it's much too brief in the conclusion, is that ideally, I do think that there's a way in which certain forms of taking political action with others, and I try and talk about organizing as, in that sense, a kind of grassroots form of governmentality, right? Like we are to think about our relationships with others as being emancipatory, even though they're relations of power with each other, as we try and move others to action and try to get them to do what we want, which is come to our meeting, come to our rally, come to our sit-in, whatever. And so I do think that ideally there are things we can take from those kinds of experiences that can be helpful in reorienting us towards larger institutions. But of course, it's not perfectly analogous, and we can't make the move from interpersonal to institutional without analysis. It can't just be, in that sense, lived experience will rarely be enough to do that on its own in that way. And so, on the other hand, it's like everybody is going to be very naive when they start doing political action, and they will invariably be doing things that are probably at least occasionally counterproductive, right? And so I don't think there's any like clear universal answer to like what, I mean, some people have had very productive experiences in very bad movements that have become very like illuminating for them personally, but obviously that's not the kind of thing we want to generally recommend. So I don't know how much to say, how much I can say clearly in general about that.
We have about 2 more minutes until I at least have to dash madly out the door.
Then I didn't want to ask this question because I feel like it takes us away from the sort of beautifully careful theoretical orientation you've put us towards. But I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about where you think this places us in terms of how we engage in organizing strategies around the supply chain. So when I asked, why not class war, it wasn't a sort of like flat-footed sense that we all need to be engaged in unionizing Amazon. I think that the supply chain precisely pulls us towards a much more complicated necessity of thinking about how scales of organizing at a kind of union by union or single institutional level is not enough. But the other source, of supply chain organizing might be things like institutional divestment. It might be widespread boycott campaigns. That's sort of more on the consumer side. And then I think that there are, interestingly sort of like emerging kind of strategies. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Jennifer. Bye. Like thinking about port blockades and forms of riot in which the community works together with organizers within workplaces to think about stoppages to the supply chain in ways that sort of, arrest the movement of capital. So I guess I just was really, I wanted to ask you, and I know that this is outside of the scope of the book, but how would you imagine organizing around the supply chain, and what do you think the kind of dispositional investment in a freedom we do not yet know, given that we've grown up in unjust institutions, help us to think about where we go, how we organize?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question, and I think that I think that you're right that in a certain sense it's like a more important question than the question that the book asks, because it is a question about like what particular actions to take. And I think that, I guess, so in that sense, there's a way in which the book is a kind of ground clearing, in that there are a lot of people who don't know enough about supply chains and maybe whose self-understandings are still too closely tied to neoliberal conceptions to think through tactics in a politically informed way. And so maybe in that way, the book is just kind of a preparation for asking that question, which is in a lot of ways the like politically consequential one, it really is the what is to be done question. I do think that there are ways in which I mean, I'm very much a like all of the above kind of person when it comes to tactics. And I think that the kinds of things that the book's conception of freedom rules out, you know, are going to be approaches that that engage in kind of paternalism or condescension towards other people who are part of the movement. And it, you know, it encourages, you know, for reasons of freedom, encourages kind of deference to people who are, you know, people who are not beneficiaries of injustice, since they're, I think, more apt to see certain things clearly. So I think that the main, I mean, in a lot of ways, sort of the main tactical thing is just a sense that there would be something helpful about going back to something like a kind of World Social Forum model where there were more venues for transnational organizing, and that where there were more places where the people who are affected by this could discuss it together, which is not, you know, I mean, there are obvious limits to that. That's, you know, that's not a tactic. That's like a way to come up with a tactic. So it's still at a level of remove from your question. But in the
actually, I do think that does answer it. I think helping us to think about modes of democratic engagement with questions of supply chains through various media like the social forum is precisely what I was asking. So that's, yeah, that's great. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, thank you, because I was just going to trail off, and I'm relieved you rescued me.
I was just going to, what if the mode of overlapping consensus we're looking for was always already Marxist internationalism, right? I mean, like they're like one of the older forms of that, what I think you just pointed to, right, was like an older form of world socialism, which I think this is right, your diagnosis is right, like those spaces were destroyed, right? They were absolutely obliterated, not by neoliberalism, right, but by Cold War, jingoistic American, like neoclassical economic theory, by Keynesianism, right?
Well, not just, I mean, 9/11 too, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, like, so such that neoliberalism arrives at precisely the right moment to then be its own blockade against a genuine solidaristic internationalism, and all that's in place is a fetishized commodity internationalism, right? So I mean, it's you know, I think it's actually a virtue of the book. I'd say the last 3 paragraphs are entirely about this is what we have. This is it's people whom supply chain seeks to govern become partners, then they express freedoms that they would otherwise not have had. They become different people, right? Like that's actually the through line here, is that the space of international solidaristic campaign work creates new subjects. And if it doesn't, maybe that's the internal test. Like if your new social movement fails, in fact, to generate a new subjectivity, then it's then it's not the right kind of social movement, right? If we don't become different people in those partnerships, and the last 3 paragraphs say this like in 3 different ways, right? If we don't become different people as a result of this, if we just figure out how to still be the students we already were, but now we don't have sweatshops, right? Right, like that's actually the failure of that social movement. If it becomes we're different kind of people as a result of that organizing around that particular issue, then we've actually resisted the neoliberal subjectivity, right, at that subjectivity level, right? So maybe that goes to, I think, Samuel's question, right? Like that's a specifically queer disorientation where identity no longer does the work that it claims it does and always fails to do, right? That's where I read the last 3 paragraphs. That's what I want the last 3 paragraphs.
No, I mean, I think that's really beautifully put. And I think both in terms of your comments on the level of subjectivity, but also your observation about, in effect, the book is about the fact that we're still looking for a form of post-Cold War internationalism, and that it's an effort in some respects to recuperate what was going on before the war in Iraq and the Bush administration set us on this new stage of combining neoliberalism with intensified surveillance. And in many ways, right, we're obviously still occupying that world and trying to figure out what it will mean to work together under these conditions.
reaching across the veil,
Thank you,
right?
Ben.
That's Du Bois's metaphor, right? Reaching across, not, yeah, okay, I'll shut up. This is too much fun.
Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. I know we're now over, so I'm really grateful to everyone for coming, and especially to the critics for their fantastic comments and engagement. I'm really grateful. So thanks, everybody.
Congratulations, Ben.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.